Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Hi, I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why, philosophical discussions about everyday life. Today we welcome our guest Jennifer M Morton and ask, what are the ethical costs of upward mobility? The idea known as the American dream was popularized during the Great Depression. It encapsulates a long history of democracy building, fluid social status, and upward mobility. We've seen it celebrated and criticized in the stories of immigrants as symbolized by the Statue of Liberty, the precariousness of the family farm as in the Grapes of Wrath, and tales of rise and fall as diverse as The Great Gatsby and the legendary TV series VH1 Behind the Music. In its simplest form, it suggests that American freedom is best understood as economic opportunity. It tells us that everyone who is persistent, hardworking, and has the right values can build a good life. It has been the mantra behind middle-class growth and the secret faith that makes poor people vote against taxing the rich because they're convinced that they too will someday be rich. I don't think I have to go over the ways in which the American dream has failed so many. Race, sex, religion, lack of resources in rural areas, unequal education, unaffordable cities, and the dominance of corporate-based profiteering all make the dream more of a myth than a promise. We'll talk about this on today's episode for sure, but that's not what we'll focus on. What we are mostly concerned with is the very selective description of success it has communicated to all of us. To explain this, I'd like to go back to the writings of a Scottish philosopher, not an American, and to a book written in 1759 before America's founding. I'd like to explore a story Adam Smith tells. Yes, that Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, the patron saint of capitalism, and the author of Wealth of Nations. In his first book, right before he introduces his famous metaphor of the invisible hand, he tells the story of the poor man's son, about whom he writes, "Heaven in its anger has visited him with ambition." The poor man's son hated everything about his life. His father's house was too small, he hated riding a horse, he longed for servants, so he dedicated his life to overcoming his poverty. He worked day and night, called attention to his abilities whenever he could, and became the ultimate opportunist. He even dressed and acted like those he envied until he became one of them. He ended up being very successful, but when he finally came home, an old man, broken from effort and relentless focus, he realized that he had wasted his life. He had sacrificed family, community, and moral goodness in the name of riches that lied about what happiness was. He had fancy tweezer cases, an impressive toothpick, but no tranquility. His endless toys made him neither better than anyone else nor satisfied. He had traded everything truly valuable for power and riches that Smith, in his 18th century way, called enormous and operose machines contrived to produce a few trifling conveniencies. To put this in more familiar terms, it's pretty cool to own a robot that will bring you beer, but it's a hell of a lot more satisfying to have your child bring it and then sit next to you as you enjoy each other's existence. History is full of attacks on materialism, but Smith's is special because it emphasizes what our guest will call ethical goods. Smith claims that there are two different roads that anyone can walk. One leads to the study of wisdom and the practice of virtue, and the other to the acquisition of wealth and greatness. But for the thoughtful and reflective person, they are similar. They provide both goodness and material gain. But for the greedy, the selfish, the avaricious, the road leads to loneliness, isolation, and grief. Another way to think about this is, again, anticipating our guest, we must all choose our ethical narrative, the story we tell ourselves that moves us toward our values and goals. Smith is a very important thinker. The case can be made that in addition to founding modern economics, he also invented sociology and the modern discipline of English. But he still wrote in the 18th century, and it was just too early for him to articulate many of the insights we now have about community, psychology, structural racism, and accountability in such a complex world that he could not have anticipated. This is where our guest comes in. In her work, she looks specifically at what people lose in their upward journey and helps identify those key moments that require decisions, self knowledge, and reframing our own stories. Smith never asked a question she centers: why was my old life valuable in and of itself? On today's show, we're going to look at the lives of people who strive to rise up the economic classes. We'll explore their role in deciding what is important to them and what they should leave behind. We'll also examine the ways that educational institutions, in particular, force the ambitious to choose between their old and new selves and highlight what that might cost them in the process. There was a time when parents and children's lives were pretty much the same, and people's worst fears were that things would deteriorate, that life would only get worse. Then the Enlightenment came along and we invented the concept of progress. Eventually, the industrial world insisted that unless every successive generation was better off than the ones before them, our elders have failed. On today's show, we aren't really going to ask whether this is true, although we might. Instead, we'll identify what people have jettisoned in the name of progress and the human connections we sever when we relentlessly stare into the future. And now our guest. Jennifer M. Morton is the Presidential Penn Compact Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania and a member of the Graduate School of Education. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for Ethics and Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is the author of Moving Up Without Losing Your Way: The Ethical Costs of Upward Mobility, published by Princeton University Press. Jennifer, welcome to Why.
Hi, Jack. It's so delightful to be here. And thank you for that fantastic introduction. Truly remarkable.
Thank you so much. That is tremendously kind, but I had rich material to work from. To our listeners, if you'd like to participate, please share your favorite moments from the show and tag us on social networks. Our handle is always at Y Radio Show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platform so that the others can find the show and listen to all 17 seasons worth of episodes for free, as well as our sister show, Philosophical Currents, at our website, whyradioshow.org. That's whyradioshow.org. And as always, the show can only happen with your support. We exist solely on listener contributions. So click donate in the upper right-hand corner of our website to make your tax-deductible donation through the University of North Dakota Alumni Foundation portal. So, Jen, I mentioned Adam Smith in my monologue, and he believes that all people have a perpetual desire to better their own condition, that it is human nature to always want a better life. My question is, why should we address upward mobility ethically and not just a brute fact of our existence of just humans want more and that's just the way it is?
Such a great question to get us started. And I don't disagree with Smith that many people want more. And I think the question is what our society asks us to sacrifice in the pursuit of better lives. The nice example of the ambitious son from Smith might make us think, well, some people are just strivers, and that can have sometimes a negative connotation. They're just constantly wanting more, constantly wanting to climb the ladder. And in some ways, my book is not really about those cases. You might think those cases will exist, throughout time, throughout history, however our society is organized. My focus in the book is on the striver who's someone who wants better life for themselves because they want the stability of a good job, a good career. That's what they're trying to find. So, not riches, not, climbing to the top of the ladder, but just a better, more stable life than the one that they grew up in. And my question is, what do we ask people in that position to give up to achieve what, as you pointed out, for a long time was thought of as the American dream, the kind of middle class job, the middle class life, owning a home, having a family, and so on. And I think that increasingly we make it so difficult for some people who want that to get it. We ask them to sacrifice way too much. So even though they're a really ambitious person who wants to be, on the Forbes 30 under 30 or be a millionaire, of course they're going to have to sacrifice a lot. But do we have to sacrifice a lot just to achieve a middle class lifestyle? And that's what I think we increasingly ask people to sacrifice more and more, and I'm not sure that we should.
How much of this is the legacy of particular cultures, and how much of this is the push of capitalism, and how much of this is just human beings want to find stability? And I guess what I'm really asking is, a lot of your discussions are international in the sense that the students you highlight in your book are often either immigrants or first or second generation folks. Is this push for this kind of stability universal, or is this just something particular about where we live now and our time as we describe it?
So I think that human beings seek stability and security probably in a pretty fundamental way. And we see that desire recur in the history of philosophy. So, another um, British philosopher, along with Smith, is Thomas Hobbes, who I'm very interested in. And Hobbes thought that the reason that we have political community and society in the first place is because we want to escape the insecurity and instability that comes from not having government, right? What government gives us is the stability and security we need to then be able to lead our lives, have our projects, pursue our passions, have a family, and so on. And it's sort of a precondition, I think, for a lot of the ambitions that we might have, big and small. But I do think there's something particular about how this has played out in the United States, which is that during the middle of the 20th century, this idea that there was an American dream, a kind of middle class lifestyle of security and stability, has become an article of faith for many Americans, that that is something that is achievable. And the way in which it's achievable and for whom it is achievable and to what extent it's achievable, that has changed over time. And the less and less achievable it seems, I think, the more and more people feel like it's unjust and unfair that it is not achievable for them. But it's not simply, I think, an article of faith that, say, the immigrant like myself that arrived to this country was looking for. I think it's become something that used to be achievable, for example, for many people who grew up in rural small towns across America, who are now finding that their towns are being decimated by poverty and lack of opportunity. And so I think many people are affected by the erosion of a pathway to that kind of American dream.
The contrast between Hobbes and Smith is really interesting because Hobbes is a radical individualist in his state of nature. We don't have to get into the details, and he really sees human beings as fundamentally separate, inherently competitive, establishing their own desires as good or bad, and that community and society is a compromise in the face of fear. Smith argues against this and argues specifically against Hobbes, and he thinks human beings have always lived in community, that people are inherently social, that they see themselves through other people's eyes, and that it can't be any other way. And so I guess the question that triggers in me is, when you are talking about strivers and when you are talking about these folks who are trying to get a better life, how much do you think of them in terms of individuals, in terms of free agents who can come and go and love and not love and be loyal or disloyal as they please? And how much do you see them as people who are carrying their community with them and who are inseparable from their past, even as they are, separated or forced to move past the past? How much, when we're talking about upward mobility, how much is this about individuals and how much is this about relationships, collectives, and communities?
The way that I think of it is that strivers are, as you said, parts of community, exist in a social world in which often the reasons that they want to better their lives has to do with bettering the lives of those they love as well. That we don't see ourselves as just trying to achieve mobility for our own sakes or for our own ambitions. Surely there are people who are like that, but I think a lot of the strivers I talk to and describe in the book are really concerned with those they love, with their families, with their communities. Um, and so when we think about striving, I think part of the narrative that we've bought into is this idea that it's an individual who's pursuing their own individual advancement. And we often ignore the fact that individuals are connected to others they love and that they bring that, for me as a college professor, they bring that to the college campus. So, one of the pieces of research that I talk about in the book and that is quite interesting has been done by psychologist Nicole Stevens at Northwestern. And she talks about these two cultural styles that people might have. One she calls the interdependent cultural style, which means that you think of yourself in relationship to your family, your community, your social role, and the independent cultural style, which means that you think of yourself, as you said, as an individual, the Hobbesian individual thinking about their own ambitions and their own interests. And one of the interesting findings that she discusses is that when she has done these surveys at college campuses, she asked faculty and staff and students to answer certain questions to figure out what kind of framework they're bringing, the interdependent or the independent. She finds that many college professors, staff, and students whose parents went to college have the more independent cultural framework than many working class students, students who are the first in their families to go to college, actually have a more interdependent cultural model. And she argues that there is this kind of clash that happens sometimes in the classroom. A student comes thinking of themselves as connected to their family, thinking about their role in their community, and find that within the college, a lot of other people are not thinking the same way. And this creates, she argues, a kind of mismatch. So that idea that how do we think of ourselves as individuals, as connected and kind of inherently social or not, is actually a big source of mismatch within the college campus.
So I have two immediate reactions to that. The first one is, as a teacher, part of me thinks, well, how can it be otherwise? Because the students are alone in the classroom. They're not with their family. They're not with their siblings. They are being evaluated by their own work and all of that sort of stuff. But there's another more controversial reaction that when I hear that, it makes me think about conservative critics of higher education who say universities socialize students to be more liberal and more individualistic and are pulling away from traditional cultures, and that they are less family oriented and more, here in North Dakota, they'd say more East Coast than when they started. How much truth is there in the sense, and I don't mean making people have positions on abortion or death penalty or anything like that.
Right,
I just
right.
mean, how much does the modern university require us to think about students as, technical term, liberal individuals, as opposed to community members first, and a more conservative, communitarian, interdependent, as you used the word, way? How necessary is that?
So I think there is something to this conservative worry about the university, and I share it. I'll just tell you the story of coming from a very non conservative place. So when I started writing this book, I was teaching at the City College of New York, CUNY, up in Manhattan. And many of my students were students of color, working class students, immigrants or children of immigrants. And what I found was that many of these students were very deeply connected to their communities and their families. And this often was a source of tension and a challenge for their ability to meet the demands of the college campus. I mean, an important difference was that from the kind of campus I teach at now is that many of those students lived at home. So they went to their classes and then at the end of the day they'd go home to their parents' homes. And so they were deeply connected to their families. And I found this conflict would carry over into when students would miss class or not be able to turn in a paper. And I would ask them, okay, what happened? Tell me a little bit more. Often the kinds of reasons that they had to do with being there for their families, being there for their communities. I remember a student who said, I'm sorry I missed class. My cousin had to go to work and he has kids and his childcare fell through. And so he asked me to do it, and I said yes. And those were the kind of decisions that the students faced over and over again. And I think there is a way in which the university and how we think about higher education isn't well suited to sometimes accommodate a student. There comes in a way with their family and community, deeply embedded in that way. I'm not sure exactly how to rethink what the university could do with respect to that. But just to take one example, when students apply for financial aid, we don't often take into account that a college student might be working to help their family financially or providing childcare or elder care for their family. That just doesn't kind of figure in the calculations that we make in thinking about a college student's financial aid package. But often a student going to college is not just that they have to maybe take on debt to pay for college, but their families are losing income or childcare or elder care. We don't, that doesn't figure in how we're thinking about the college aged adult that is coming into our campuses. So I think there is some truth to that conservative critique that we, in some ways, just see the student as this individual and think about advising that individual's opportunities and sort of miss sometimes that the student comes to campus, some students at least, in ways that are deeply connected and enmeshed to a community and a family, and that is important to the student, and they're bringing that to the classroom.
We have to take a break. When we get back, I want to ask you about this notion of ethical goods that you describe in the book and its partner ethical narrative. And we'll talk more conceptually about the problem that you're describing, which I will summarize because I don't know that we've said it explicitly, that when you gain success and move up the ladder, the economic ladder, you often are forced to leave behind your community and your connections and past values. But we'll unpack that when we get back. You've been listening to Jennifer M. Norton and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. We'll be back right after this.
The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life bridges the gap between academic philosophy and the general public. Its mission is to cultivate discussion between philosophy professionals and others who have an interest in the subject, regardless of experience or credentials. Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because there is no ivory tower.
And you're back. You're listening to Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We're talking with Jennifer M. Norton about her book, Moving Up Without Losing Your Way. And we're investigating the things that we leave behind as we gain economic success, the community, the connections, the traditional values, the history that we might have to jettison. And long-term listeners of the show will have heard me talk about my background before, which is I was born in Washington Heights. I was born in 1969, and I was born and raised in this part of Manhattan on the edge of Spanish Harlem during the crack epidemic of the 1970s and 80s. And Washington Heights was, for a variety of geographical reasons and demographic reasons, the distribution center and the center of the crack epidemic. The I grew up very poor, and the police district that I grew up in, the 34th precinct, had the highest murder rate in the city. And I always tell people, if they want to know what my life was like, they should take a look at the 1990 movie New Jack City, which was Ice-T's first film. It takes place two blocks from my apartment. And of course, a lot of awful things happened and very difficult things happened. And of course, a lot of good things happened in my life. And when I tell the story, I have to choose between whether I'm romanticizing the circumstance or whether I'm emphasizing how awful it would be. And when I left, I had to decide what part of it I was going to miss and what part of it I was going to take with me. And so, Jennifer, the question I want to ask you is, you have this question of this notion of ethical goods, which I'd like you to explain. But then for those people who come from difficult backgrounds, the good and the bad aren't necessarily clear and they're not necessarily distinct. Something bad can develop good capabilities or a special way of seeing something, and something good may make you more dependent or less able to roll with the punches, right? When you are talking about ethical goods, help us understand how people pick and choose the aspects of their culture and history that they feel loyal to, and what they are how they decide what to let go of.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question to think about, Jack. And it's interesting in light of your experience. I actually was in Washington Heights a couple of weeks ago, and it's very different now
It
than
is
where it was
very
when
different.
you
It's so different that they've made a major musical out of it. Lin-Manuel
right.
Miranda's first The Heights, there was not a lot of organized singing and dancing on the street corner, but there were a lot of gang members with what we call boom boxes back then in the olden days. The scenes that were filmed in the area, I recognize the neighborhood, but the Heights that he describes was not the Heights that I grew up in.
Yeah. That is so interesting. But I one way to think about it is that the ethical goods are those aspects of your life that make it meaningful, valuable, that contribute to your flourishing. And the way that I think about it is that for many of us, those aspects are going to be family, friends, community, aspects of our identity or our culture, perhaps. It might be a religious community, religious values. And that's what a young person kind of comes into the world armed with when they're coming into college, coming into the college classroom. Now, young people are at that stage often in their late teens, early 20s, where they're changing a lot. They're kind of trying to figure out, what the future looks like, what they care about. And they can be very kind of shaped by the environment and the messages they hear from whether it's a college professor or the college classroom. And again, I don't want to paint this as a question of indoctrination. I think that gives us college professors way too much credit. But what friends you make, what opportunities you find, and when I talked to strivers who had been successful for my book, what many of them described was this feeling of pursuing opportunities, working really hard to get a degree, to get a good job, and sometimes sacrificing some of the bonds that they had with those ethical goods they had grown up with. A lot of times that wasn't conscious. It wasn't like somebody sat down and said, look, to achieve opportunity, I'm going to have to distance myself from extended family or distance myself from my community. It happened little by little over time. And I think part of the reason it happened is that we sometimes don't give young people the space to really reflect on the values that they have, on the values that they really care about, and on the values that they want to preserve. And so when I talked to the strivers I talked to for my book, they were many years out of college, many of them were working, and they were looking back and thinking, I didn't need to make some of the sacrifices I made or lose some of the relationships I did. I just didn't realize that's what was happening. And so those were some of the trade-offs that I saw. And that's why in the book I argued that it is important to have a kind of ethical narrative, a story you're telling yourself about what you're doing, why you're doing, and why it matters to you. And it's surprising. Sometimes I teach philosophy of education and I have my students think a lot about why they're in college, what they're hoping to get out of it. And many of them have applied to college, signed up, you know, et cetera, et cetera. They're there at the college classroom and they haven't asked themselves that question, which is surprising. But I think we don't give students the opportunity sometimes to think, in this kind of ethically reflective way about what they're doing and why they're doing. To your point about there being, we don't want to romanticize what one came from, I think that is also clearly important. And there are some of the strivers I talked to, this one man, Jerron, he grew up with his mom was addicted to drugs. He was often unhoused. They moved from place to place. He was just in a really kind of, you might think, a terrible home situation. And leaving for him was leaving all of that behind, right? He told me that's the only way he thought he could succeed is he pushing it all away. But what was interesting to me about Jerron is that after having gotten his undergraduate degree and then gotten a master's degree, he ended up working at a university and he had started going back to his community because he really felt like he wanted to help and find a way to help other kids who were there, and who hadn't had the opportunity to leave as he had. And so I think that's an example of having this sense of there is a value there that he wanted to preserve. There were ethical goods there that he wanted to be a part in helping, but it was difficult, obviously. It involved him distancing himself from his family and his community for many years before he was able to do that. So I don't mean to suggest this is a simple process or a straightforward process, but asking oneself those questions, reflecting on them, thinking carefully about them, I think is really important because otherwise, what I saw in the interviews I did and in my experience teaching is that students kind of get sometimes pushed around by what feels easiest or what other people say or their peers say. And they maybe don't have the space to develop the kind of story about themselves that will give them the resources to push back when they're being pushed in ways that maybe go against their values. One of the other people I talked to in the book, this young woman, Kimberly, told me how in school she was supporting her mom financially. In school, people would say, "Why are you supporting your mom? You should spend that money instead going on spring break." And she would say, "No, my family." She had this really clear, articulated sense of what mattered to her, and her family mattered, and being loyal to her family and helping family was such an important value to her, and she was so clear about that. And she would say this to her friends, but not. I think if you haven't had the time to reflect and articulate that to yourself, you might easily be afraid or ashamed or not have the kind of ethical backbone to stand up when somebody is questioning your choices.
There are so many threads that we're gonna come back to in that, including responsibility to help other people and complicity in the the loss of this connection, but I wanna focus a little more on ethical goods because this is an abstract idea, and the thing that comes to mind is my daughter who is now at, college in Manhattan. She grew up, we always had home-cooked meals, longtime listeners know I'm a hobbyist baker, so we always had homemade bread, and we would sit down and have these meals, and now, because of where she lives and her life, she gets a lot of takeout, she buys a lot of prepared foods and foods that she can microwave for the next 4 meals, and she tries to do a little cooking, but it's a dorm kitchen, and that's hard. Is home-cooked meal an ethical good? Is sitting around with your family at the end of the day and having a dinner together an ethical good? And is that inherently a loss if you don't have that?
I think a home cooked meal shared with family can be an example of a kind of good that makes our lives go well, that leads us to flourish. And it's certainly something that hopefully your daughter will return to when conditions allow. Um, I relate to being, in college, as I'm sure you do too, Jack. I mean, like, I
Yes.
don't have time for anything but a ramen. But it's not the kind of good that I focus on in the book because the kind of goods that I'm really concerned with are the ones that when they erode, it's really hard to get them back. Sometimes philosophers call these things irreplaceable, right? So if there's someone in your life that you have a very close relationship to that you love and you for some reason lose them or that relationship erodes, there's a sense in which you can't get that back, even if you don't go on to have another relationship or somebody else that you're close to. So I think about this with my relationship with my grandmother. I grew up, my mom was a teen mom. My grandmother basically raised me. And we were very, very close when I was growing up. It was just the two of us. And we're still close, but she lives back in Peru where I grew up. And there's a sense in which we're not as close as we used to be. And our relationship is different because of that distance. And that is a kind of sacrifice that I made when I decided to pursue higher education elsewhere. And I can see that that's not a sacrifice that other people I went to school with made who stayed back home, who stayed in Lima, and who still go to Sunday dinner with the family, which is something that I'm sure a lot of the Latino listeners will be familiar with. It's a rite of passage, it's a ritual that families have and that I don't really get to participate in anymore. So that's the kind of ethical good I have in mind, which is that even if here in Philadelphia I have friends and we get together on the weekend and have a nice meal together, it's not a replacement for having a Sunday lunch with my grandmother. And that those are the kind of ethical goods that I think when we lose them, we really mourn their loss and feel like our lives have been made a little worse off, even if in other respects they have been made better.
It's such an interesting example because on the one hand, you become a professional philosopher and you teach at a university, and even if you were still in Lima, coming home to your grandmother and talking about reading Martha Nussbaum's latest book, that's not gonna work
Right.
regardless, right? But so there's a natural division that happens, but what is also super interesting is this multi-generational household, this connection that many cultures still have where the grandparents help raise the children, and where there's the family dinner every Sunday or whenever. These are things that inequality is forcing us to go back to, right? Because housing is so expensive, especially in the cities, now multi-generations are living in the same small apartment for people who make an income that 30 years ago they wouldn't have to do that. And because childcare is so expensive, parents are relying on their own parents for taking care of them during the day, when maybe 20 years ago that would have been a personal choice as opposed to a necessity. So there's this inverse relationship between this closeness and this multi-generational experience and poverty. Is that a necessary relationship? The more wealthy, the better material foundation we have, do we necessarily become more individualistic? How much is what you're describing just the consequence of very few resources and the necessity of relying upon each other in a way that once you reach a certain standard of living, you just don't have to do anymore?
I don't think that there's anything necessary about it, although I do agree that when you're facing economic hardship, turning to family and community and having that kind of close sharing of resources, sharing of a house can be a way of dealing with that situation. But I guess I think that and I will say this, growing up in Lima, I it is part of the culture that family have this time together across the different kind of economic spectrum. It looks very different, of course, if you're, more working class or if you're more well off, but it's not something that is reserved or the exclusive province of working class people. And I will say myself, my husband, who grew up comfortably middle class here in the United States, his sister lives not far from his parents, and they still have that kind of relationship, and not because of any financial hardship, but because they choose to do that. So I don't think there's anything necessary about it. But what has happened is that those kind of values, I think, have been more difficult for some people to enact. And here I'm thinking some of the people I interviewed for my book, and also I briefly taught at UNC Chapel Hill and interacted with first generation college students from North Carolina. In some rural communities, for example, there is this understanding that if you are a talented young person who's going to pursue a college education, you're probably never coming back, right? And that was kind of the frame around which some of the young students I talked to had arrived on the college campus. This kind of sense that to choose economic opportunity through college meant consigning yourself to being far from your family. And that hasn't always been true. And so I think that kind of change is important to recognize. I don't think that it's kind of built into the very idea of being upwardly mobile that you leave your family at a distance or that you distance yourself from your community. Um,
The Appalachian experience is super interesting, and my wife is a literacy scholar and works in Appalachian, has found a lot of commonalities between Appalachian and North Dakota in particular. And there's this whole discourse about leaving your community and carrying it with you, and the relationship between literacy and identity, which I'll ask you about it in a couple minutes. And there's really interesting work by Richard Rodriguez in his book Hunger of Memory,
mhm.
and Larry Palmer, Scholarship Boy, and Mike Rose, who we had on the show. Actually, we had my wife on the show too. And there's all this really rich, deep literature about this idea of having one foot in one place that you have to leave and one foot not, and having what you refer to in the book as a split identity. And so I guess I'd like to ask you about these two ideas that you call attention to. The first, as I just said, is the split identity, that we aren't necessarily a unified person and we are different people in different contexts, but also this idea of complicity, that to some extent we become guilty of cultivating these problems, and that we don't necessarily look back at and help other people. What is a split identity? What are the risks therein? And what does that tell us about the accountability and the complicity we have for the choices we make about our ethical goods?
Yeah, I think that the idea of split identity is or I call it kind of cultural code switching, right? That you behave one way in one space and another way in another is something that everybody's familiar with to some degree, right? You behave one way at work than you do at home, or one way with your friends than you do in another space. What happens sometimes if you come from working class background or you're a member of an underrepresented minority and you're in one of these spaces where you're trying to seek whether it's educational opportunities or career opportunities, is that you start to feel a little bit like you have to act a different way, and you have to act in a way that to some extent hides or obscures the place where you came from. And that I think is where we start to feel a little bit of the danger of complicity, the sense that you try to blend in with the dominant way of behaving or the dominant expectations, and to some extent hide where, your community, your background, and so on. And that can feel, for many of the strivers I talk to, it can feel ethically fraught in the sense that you feel like you're being inauthentic. Now, I'm not saying that you should feel like you're inauthentic. I'm just describing that people do sometimes feel that way. And the reason that I think this can become a problem is that some drivers who are kind of in the situation of being caught between those two worlds can experience a tension in their values, right? Where they have hold a particular kind of value or outlook on the world that they are committed to, they're reflective about, but then they go to work and they find that that is discouraged or not the kind of attitude that people share. And so you might not want to speak up about it or bring it to light. Um, and that might create a kind of tension within you. For example, I think that for all that we talk about higher education, being a place in which people can't perhaps share their backgrounds, I do think we have made progress on this front, in the sense that I think it's become a bit more okay for a student from a working class background, for example, to reveal that they have potentially a different perspective. So I'll give you an example. I recently taught a seminar on poverty, and we were talking very theoretically, reading some economics, some philosophy, some political science about poverty. And there were a couple of people in that room who revealed that they had grown up on food stamps, or that they had had those experiences. And at Penn, most of the students are pretty well off, and that took a lot of courage and guts, but it was really important for us to understand the phenomenon we were discussing. That perspective really helped all of us in the classroom. But it can be difficult for a student to be able to do that and to reveal that about themselves. And that's like a very small example, but you can imagine this happening in all sorts of different spaces. And sometimes when we hide that, or we're not comfortable bringing that up, that can lead us to feeling complicit, or like we're just accepting that, this perspective is not valid here, this perspective is not valued.
This is a very familiar experience to me when I taught at Fresno State for a couple of years, which was a very mixed, particularly Hispanic student population. The students were open books. We'd start talking, and they would reveal in the middle of class the most intimate things and just spew it all out for us to talk about, and everyone was just fully committed in that way. And then I came to North Dakota, which is much more conservative and homogeneous, and the students were very closed off and very limited in even expressing their own opinion as opposed to their own experiences. But I want to go back to this notion of cultural code switching because I want to compare two things, and I want you to sort of tell me how they're different and why one is more robust or meaningful than the other. When I taught in Berea College, which was this Appalachian neo-fundamentalist Christian college, I had a girlfriend at the time, and she used to say that she could watch me cross the street onto a campus, and I would get on the campus and I would start to stand up and I would become Professor Jack in front of her eyes. And the person who I was on one side of the street was very different than I was on the other. Now, that's one thing. But there's a different experience of, let's say, code switching where Black students will talk Ave, African American vernacular English, Black English, at home or with their friends, but be much more reluctant to use that kind of language in class or at the workplace, that there's a that part of what formality and professionalism, which you talk about in the book, necessitates, or they think it necessitates, is speaking and holding themselves and expressing themselves in fundamentally different ways. Now, that's what you're talking about, and that's much more robust and laden. Why is that different and more ethically complex and fraught than the code switching, quote unquote, that I did of being Jack private individual and Jack qua Professor Jack? Why is the Ave example so much more complicated?
Yeah. So the example of African American vernacular is actually pretty interesting because I'm not sure that I would think of that as an ethically fraught case necessarily. I think there is a lot, obviously, historically, that can make that an ethically fraught situation for a student. But I think we have to be really careful about distinguishing just like kind of ways of talking or dressing, like you said, interacting that change depending on the setting we're in from when our values get compromised because we're in a different setting. And so sometimes I feel like we put a big stock on a kind of authenticity and that I should be able to dress or talk or whatever the way I want in this setting or that setting, which fair enough, you make your choices. But I think the fact that there are professional norms in some spaces isn't by itself something that we should be worried about. I think what's the real worry is when whatever the norms are in the workplace or in a college campus or whatever are making you compromise on something that's really important to you or silencing you when it comes to saying something that might be really important to be said in that space. So I would think of cases in which, and this has happened to me early on in my career when I was a young assistant professor, also when I was in graduate school, where I really felt it was important for me to kind of try to fit in as much as I could and try to kind of go along and be a good colleague. And there were choices that whether it was the department was making or other professors were making or arguing for, where when I put myself in the position of someone that didn't come from this world, that, was a first generation college student, I could see that this was going to be challenging for other people like me. But in calling that to light, I would have to out myself and say, actually, this policy will really work for some of our students or this, and that was the kind of challenge where you're in a situation where you feel very strongly that the right thing to say or do is one thing, but in the process of doing it, you would really call to light something about yourself. And so, to return to your first example about the African American vernacular, I think that can be sometimes, it's not the talking this or that way itself, but sometimes it's just making the space in which you are notice that not everybody is coming from the same place, right? Calling to light that this is a space in which there's more diversity than we're assuming, in which not everybody um, grew up talking the same way or thinking the same way or having the same experience. It can have that function, but I usually try to focus more on the values that are at stake, right? What value am I trying to promote here? What value am I sacrificing? And is my workplace or this college campus making me feel like I have to sacrifice on an important value for me? Is that worth it to me? Those sorts of questions.
I want to push this because maybe there's a miscommunication here and we're saying the same thing, or maybe I'm misunderstanding something. But I want to push this because the example of Ave, one of the great complaints, writ large, is that what professionalism tends to mean in the United States is erasing blackness. And so there have been Supreme Court cases about whether or not uh, black flight attendants can have cornrows or natural hairstyle, and that so much of what we call, again, this word professionalism is perceived by many as erasing non-whiteness, that you can't talk Ave in the office because it's unprofessional and it sounds uneducated and you don't sound smart, and you can't bring cornrows into the office because you don't look like everyone else. And even though cornrows is a statement about values and history and originate, they're originally the maps that slaves used to teach other slaves how to escape. That's what the beads are, and the cornrows. And so maybe, like I said, we're just talking in slightly different language, but I guess I don't understand why that experience of
Hmm.
blackness is not welcome here under the guise of professionalism is not ethically fraught. I understand your point that if you are trying to pass, right, and someone says or does something that forces you to out yourself, that's a particularly that's an ethical
Right, right, right.
negotiation, right? But
Yeah.
even just wanting to be out and being denied the validity of that outness, I would think is also really
Yeah. Yeah.
problematic, right? So yeah,
Yeah,
so uh,
I agree with that, and I think it depends. So I think if that's a really important value to you, that what you say is completely valid. The thing I worry about is using notions of authenticity in professional spaces because I think those are a double-edged sword. There's a kind of way of being or acting that is authentic to me because I'm Latina or because I come from a certain place or because I grew up in a rural town. And what I worry about using those notions, which sometimes get used to talk about the issues that you're talking about, is that it ends up making strivers who perhaps because of their position within society, because of how financially fraught it might be for them to work in this place or go to college, um, don't act or talk or dress in the way that one might expect of them, and then they get accused of being inauthentic. So I think the authentic what makes me nervous about this language of authenticity sometimes is that it can cut both ways. It can help validate and bring to light why it feels very important for someone to be able to dress, talk, etc. in one way at in the workplace, even if it's not seen as professional. And I agree, it shouldn't be. We shouldn't use professional norms to impose whiteness, as you said. That seems clearly problematic. But we also shouldn't use notions of authenticity to create expectations of people of color that they should act in ways that we expect because they're Latino or because they're African American. And that's why I feel like talking about the values and what values matters in a way brings us back to thinking about a more fundamental issue than talking about expressing ourselves in ways that are authentic to our culture or our ethnicity, which I think is fraught for many people.
This is really interesting and really difficult because at the core of this, if I understand correctly, is a question about the spheres of assimilation as to where it's okay to expect a kind of sameness and where it's okay not to. So, for example, if I understand you correctly, and I want your thoughts on this, is it's one thing to say you can't come to work as a real estate agent wearing, I'm going to use a silly, completely outdated example, a dashiki as a black person, because that means your blackness is more important than your real estateness. And if your answer is, I can't be authentically black if I'm not wearing my dashiki, there's something wrong with that. Because what the real estate agent is saying is everyone is wearing a suit and tie, and you can be a black real estate agent in a suit and tie without doubting or questioning your blackness. And if you think that you have to wear a dashiki instead of a suit and tie, then you are putting a kind of expectation of what it means to be authentically black that is actually destructive to you and your identity, as opposed to recognizing blackness is blackness, even in a suit and tie. Am I getting that right?
I don't think that's quite how I would put it. So I think in the case you have in mind, it is important to that person. It is part of their values, right? So it's not the wearing of the dashiki, it's the fact that they really care about that outfit in light of a particular articulation of their values and what matters to them. And that's the reason that we should respect what they're saying and what their demand is, not necessarily because it has a kind of authenticity or not. So I don't think, I think we agree about many of these cases. I just ultimately like to talk about the underlying values and when we should respect the values that people have and hold rather than put it in terms of being authentic to a particular community or ethnicity or race, because I think that's when things actually get really fraught in many directions. Because, of course, within the African American community, Latino community, people understand that identity in all sorts of different ways. They have different ways of expressing that. And the fact that there's so many different ways of being Black or Latino, I think means that holding one paradigm in mind is, I think, potentially dangerous. So I don't disagree with you that in the example you had in mind, the real estate agent should be allowed to make a choice about what they want to wear. I'm questioning whether this has to do with the fact that it's this or that outfit, and this outfit is authentic to how we think about their race, or whether it just has something to do with their values and what they care about. And ultimately, that's the thing that we really should be responding to. So I'm not sure if we disagree. I get really nervous about issues of authenticity, and I'll just bring it back. Like some of the strivers I talked to who were really, trying to be good students and go to college. A few of them, got called out by other people in their community for quote unquote trying to act white. And in some ways, that is also a problematic way of thinking, right, about race and authenticity and what that means. And so, for that reason, I'm just reluctant to talk in that language. And I think when we talk about values, we get clear on what it is that matters to people and why they have a claim to make on us to accommodate them. Or I don't even like the language of accommodation, to respect their choices, really.
I want to do one more round of this before we move
Yeah,
on to
yeah.
the next topic because I think this is a really nice illustration of how philosophers think and try to sort out ambiguities. So, if I understand correctly, part of what you're doing is you're making the move to what philosophers would call justification. It's not the act; it's what justifies the act. It's what explains the act.
Hmm.
And so, there are two possible interpretations of what you're saying, as I understand it. One is so you have 2 we'll stick with my dashiki example. We have 2 real estate agents who are Black who wanna wear dashikis. One wants to wear dashiki because they think it's cool and they wanna perform something, and the other person thinks it's a dashiki because they value the tradition that it represents, and therefore their justification is more meaningful. So that's one interpretation. Another interpretation is the person who values the dashiki because it's meaningful or his history. It's one thing to value it because it's authentically Black. It's another thing to value it because it reminds them of their grandparents, or it respects their individuality, or it indicates that person is always a political person. So is the distinction that you're making that it's the intensity and the values that you choose that justifies respecting the diversity? Or is it that valuing race as a composite means that you have this definition of authenticity, and what you want to do is break it down to its component parts and liberate it from race because any person can value remembering their grandmother. Anyone can value being a political person. So, which of those, or both, or neither, interpretations am I getting right?
I guess I think in general we should respect people's choices and their values, and that's, at bottom what I'm trying to say. I think what I'm reacting against is the sense that where the rubber hits the road is when it comes to people being able to display a kind of authenticity that the workplace or a college institution is making it difficult for them to display. And it's not that I don't think that sometimes happens, that sometimes it is a way of disrespecting people's choices or disrespecting who they are. It's just that often when we dig deeper and ask ourselves what is really happening here, what we find has to do with much more than what's on the surface. And often, for example, someone's job is on the line and that's why they're acting or displaying the behavior that they're, and they like can't afford to not have a job. And at bottom I think some of these choices really have to do with pretty deep and important material constraints that people face. I personally get a little bit frustrated sometimes when we end up talking about what seems to me like conversations about authenticity that are really conversations about what opportunities people have and the extent to which people can lead lives that are really reflective of the values that they cherish. So, again, not disagree with you, that at the
Right.
end of the day, but I worry sometimes, and I've been in these kind of conversations in higher education spaces where we're talking about working class students being able to access education and succeed and have the kind of lives that they want, and how difficult it is for them to do that, the financial challenges they face, the ethical challenges they face. And then the conversation somehow becomes about kind of like the ways in which they can be authentically manifest themselves in a particular classroom. When I talk to students, that is often like a challenge and one that we should think about mitigating, but a pretty small one in the broad scope of what really is getting in the way of their success, which often is much more. My mom is disabled and I have to work full time to pay and contribute financially to our household, but I also have to go to college full time because if I don't get a college degree, I'm not going to be able to get the kind of job that will pull us out of poverty. That's like where the strivers I talk to, those are the challenges they face that are really, really difficult. And so sometimes I feel like it's not that these things are unimportant, but their importance relative to these more fundamental challenges to seems to me an important thing to keep in mind.
So there's a time and a place to have these conversations with your friends and with your community leaders. But if you say to them, look, you can criticize me all you want, but if I come to work looking this way, I'm going to lose my job and I got to feed my family. And the real conflict is I got to figure out how to do what I got to do in order to put food on the table. And the conflict that strivers face is that they are constantly encountering these strategic, real choices that can really make or break their life and make or break their well-being.
Yes.
When the rubber hits the road, as you said, that sometimes he says as a philosophy professor in a philosophy radio show, sometimes the philosophy is secondary to getting the paycheck, and what striving to move to achieve upward mobility involves is a lot of those moments where the strategic questions are significantly more important than the philosophical questions.
Yeah, and I don't know that I would say those other questions are not philosophical, but I do think, in my own experience as a striver, there have been so many times when I had to think about how I was presenting myself or how I was perceived in a particular space that were difficult and definitely fraught sometimes. But when I step back and I think, what would make it easier for someone who comes from a working class background to enter college, get a degree, find a good job, and stay connected to family and community? A lot of times the answer to that is much more material in nature, let's say,
Right.
um, than whether I was able to say X or Y in a particular classroom. Not, again, not downplaying the importance of that, obviously important, something for us to think about, but the kind of material obstacles that strivers face and being able to achieve the American dream, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, is really where they end up feeling like they have to sacrifice things that are important to them. And I think we shouldn't downplay the extent to which young people sometimes internalize some of these sacrifices they made. So, one of the reasons that I ended up writing this book is that I would talk to some of my students and they would express these feelings of feeling like they had failed, right? Like they had failed their families or they were failing as a student. And I would say, nobody in your situation could do everything that you're trying to do. Nobody can work full time to support their family and go to college full time and have like a 2-hour commute and
Right.
not kind of like not do one of those things well. But the students would uphold themselves to such crazy high standards for what they were able to do, and that to me was the kind of biggest takeaway, that they would say, "Ah, I'm such a bad son," or "I'm a bad brother because I didn't do this or that," even though they often were just caught in circumstances that left them with no good choices.
So we're just about out of time, but I need to ask one question, which of course is a massive question, but we can't treat it like a massive question, which is, what responsibilities do strivers have when they succeed to the strivers that come after them? And is this just a matter of who they decide that is important to help, if they decide people to help? Or is there a sort of inherent community obligation you have to attend to the needs of the community that you might have had to walk away from because that's where you came from? What responsibility do we have to the people who come after us, if any? And do we have more responsibilities to people we identify with or have come from than we do to other people?
I don't think we have more responsibility to the places we came from or the community necessarily. I just think that we might be in a better position to help those who are in those communities or who come from a similar place. So the way I think about it is we all have a responsibility to try to make our world a better place in whatever way we can. And we have different skills and talents and knowledge. And some of us, because of where we came from, have specific kind of knowledge about a kind of experience that makes us well positioned to help those. So I don't, it's not that I think you have more of an obligation. I just think if you step back and think, I want to do something to make this world a better place, what can I do? You probably, if you're a striver, are in a better position to help members of a disadvantaged community like the one you came from, or perhaps other strivers. But of course, that might not be the case, right? So if you're Bill Gates, probably, but you're in a position to help by just giving lots and lots of money to all sorts of charities. But if you're, like me, like a college professor, and I think, okay, where do my responsibilities lie? I think I try to do the best I can, but I probably have a kind of knowledge from my experiences that leads me to be more successful and more effective when it comes to thinking about first generation college students and strivers than a college professor that doesn't have my experiences.
Well, that is a very clear and understandable and practical way for us to reflect on what was sometimes a very abstract conversation and sometimes a very really rich story filled conversation. Jen, thank you so much for joining us on Why. This has been a really great conversation.
Thank you, Jack. This was really fun. And yeah, I had a great time. Thank you.
You have been listening to Jennifer M. Morton and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'll be back with a few more thoughts right after this.
Visit IPPL's blog, PQED, Philosophical Questions Every Day, for more philosophical discussions of everyday life. Comment on the entries and share your points of view with an ever-growing community of professional and amateur philosophers. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, our broadcasts, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyinpubliclife.org.
You're back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We were talking with Jennifer M. Morton about her book, Moving Up Without Losing Your Way, asking what people give up as they pursue success and the choices that they have to make that often sever connections with their family and friends and past. And there's a distinction in philosophy literature between metaethics and moral psychology. And that that sounds more technical than it needs to be, but metaethics is discussions of why we should make the decisions that we make, what's good, what's bad, is there a principle that we should rely on, do unto others, etc. That's metaethics. But then there's moral psychology, which tries to describe how people make ethical decisions and makes fewer claims about how people should act and more claims about how people actually think about how they act. And I think it's really useful to think about this discussion as a moral psychological conversation rather than a metaethical conversation. I think it's really important for us to understand that what Jen was doing was trying to describe real world experiences of real world people who are making real world ethical decisions and how and why they make those decisions. And that means that sometimes we have to balance practicality and value. And sometimes we have to sort of negotiate between caring for someone and going to work or doing homework. And we always have to ask, how important is the material gain and how important is this particular decision to material gain? And when we are engaged in moral psychological investigation, when we're thinking about how we think about what's good and what's bad in our lives, we also have to remind ourselves to judge ourselves fairly, that we can't do everything, that everything is a trade-off, that sometimes you have to long-term care about your college degree more than the short-term gain of being there for someone to go grocery shopping for them. But sometimes the need for you to go grocery shopping for someone is just more consequential at the moment than your long-term plan for a degree. And what moral agents, what moral people, what strivers, as she's talking about, do is have that deliberation in their head and engage with ethical values psychologically in order to make that decision before they evaluate their goodness or badness. With all of that said, if you've been listening to this episode on Sunday evening on Prairie Public, please know that a longer version with almost 30 more minutes of discussion is available online and as a podcast. Visit yradioshow.org to listen or subscribe for free. For everyone else, rate us on iTunes and Spotify to help spread the word about the show. Follow us on all the usual social networks. Our handle is always at @YRadioShow, WHY Radio Show. And please help us continue broadcasting by making your tax-deductible donation at yradioshow.org. Click donate in the upper right-hand corner to go to UND's alumni donation portal. We exist solely on the money you provide. Thank you again to my guest, Jennifer M. Morton, the folks at Prairie Public, especially our engineer, Tay Calloway. I'm Jack Russell Weinstein signing off for Y Radio. Thanks for listening. As always, it's an honor to be with you.
Y is funded by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, Prairie Public Broadcasting, and the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences and Division of Research and Economic Development. The music is written and performed by Mark Weinstein and can be found on his album Lua E Soul. For more of his music, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com or myspace.com/Mark Weinstein. Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we've inspired you with our discussion today. Remember, as we say at the Institute, there is no ivory tower.